All right, welcome back. In this part, in the previous video, I talked a bit about pricing, so setting initial pricing. We will go into how to optimize pricing here. I decided to put it into a separate video because it does fall under the category of optimization in and around both revenue and growth. So let's dive right into the topic. First, I want to summarize some key lessons from the book, The Lean Startup, where Eric Ries talks a bit about the engines of growth. And it's important for us to pay attention to these because different businesses will rely more heavily on one or the other engine. And do know as well that they are not mutually exclusive. If you're focused on one or the other, it doesn't mean that you don't do the other ones. So the key engines of growth for any business, as outlined by Eric, is the paid, viral, and sticky. Uh, you will find that you generally will probably mix and do almost all three of them, but there are certain businesses or certain types of products or service that benefit more from one or the other, which is why you want to identify your main growth engine and focus on doubling down on that. This will help you generate results a lot more quickly rather than trying to do a bit of everything at the same time. So to kind of go into each of them so you understand what each of them mean, the first one is the paid engine. Generally, the paid engine of growth refers to anything that falls under the category of advertising. And when Eric here talks about growth, growth is mostly in and around not only customer acquisition, but also revenue growth as well. So generally, for most companies to grow, you get more customers and you get it through advertising, through getting the word out there. Paid channels definitely work best for companies that have products or services that, number one, are easily understood. So something that is very visual, something that you can easily understand how your products or services differ from your competitors. You're either very unique, you're in a empty space, you don't have too many competitors, then this type of business model is going to benefit the most from the paid channel of growth. The customers don't need to experience something firsthand. If they do need to experience something before they're able to understand why your service or product is better than other services or products out there, then generally this is not the best engine to start with. We will go into that in a second. But generally, I'd say the paid engine of growth is primarily push marketing. It's more interruptive in nature. You're getting in front of the customer, right? For example, things that fall under the category of paid. So ads, we've talked a bit about that. That includes both, online and even in person, like billboards, TV or radio kind of ads. Some people would say that ads are pull, but I would say they're more push marketing because you're interrupting a customer in their day-to-day and you are getting them to come to you after you interrupt their attention. Visual merchandising is under the category of paid as well, although it's not necessarily something that you pay money for, but it's more about getting the more people to see what you're doing, right? So if you have retail displays, if you do product placement like in movies or getting influencers to carry your product, if you're promoting at trade shows, if you're selling face-to-face direct sales, then obviously all of that falls under the category of quote-unquote paid. So the key highlight here as a takeaway is if your product is number one, visual, if your product is number two, in a non-competitive space where it's easy to understand. If it's in a non-competitive space but it's difficult to understand, then this might not be the right channel. Make sense? So what if you're in a situation where you have a product or service where you're either in a very competitive space or you're doing something that's very innovative and it's hard for someone to understand your product or service and the value that it brings, then this is the second growth channel that you'll probably rely on more. This is the viral growth engine. And viral here is not so much about designing viral campaigns, because there is no surefire way effectively to guarantee that something is going to be shared and going to be viral. Viral primarily refers to the action of growth in and around referrals and word of mouth. So the types of products, services that benefit the most from a viral engine of growth are products or services where a customer has to experience, keyword here is experience, your solution firsthand before they understand the value, because maybe it's hard for them to understand how you're different from competitors, or maybe they view you as doing the same thing, but you're doing it in a different way or much better quality, then this kind of channel is the best channel for you. Or if you're in a situation where this solution is something that maybe a customer isn't aware of the problem, and you're doing something that's brand new, and this new method is going to help them open their eyes to what's possible that they never could have imagined, then maybe this channel would be more suited for you. So, some examples here would be like, if you've heard of the Landmark program, or if you've heard of PSI, those kind of life-changing programs, or even consultation services. Generally, like if you talk to someone and you say, hey, there's this program you should try, it's going to change your life. Like no one's going to understand how that's going to impact them directly, because every person's form of value is different. Same as if you say like, hey, I'm a business consultant. There's so many business consultants out there. If you say you're a construction contractor, if you're an electrician, it's going to be very difficult for you to do ads and advertising, because everyone else is going to make the same claims. They're going to say that they're the best in the industry, that they're the most trusted, blah, 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 right? So generally, best is to focus more instead on how can you make it easy for people to refer you, because you are going to find that most of your traffic, most of your customers are generally going to be coming from referrals to begin with, because it's about experiencing it firsthand, building the trust, and then when they tell other friends or family members about it, then there's already the level of trust that you don't have to try to instill in them. So a good example here is Dropbox. Dropbox, if you're thinking about innovative solutions in the early days, they noticed that all of their paid advertising strategies were not panning out. And what they found is that despite their poor marketing results, they still continue to acquire users. So they dig into like what exactly was causing it. And they found that it was really caused because people didn't quite understand what the cloud was. And they couldn't understand how it would be used for file sharing. Because back in the days, the cloud was primarily used to describe enterprise services. And when people were sharing files, it was primarily through file sharing services like rapid upload, mega upload. So using CDs, DVDs, those kind of things. So Dropbox, what they did instead is, number one, they in their program, it's in the product itself, they built referability into it. So they say, hey, if you sign up for Dropbox and you see value in it, if you refer a friend, they get 250 megabytes extra, and you get 250 megabytes extra as well. So they found that this actually increased acquisition a lot more quickly than spending all the efforts on marketing or paid ads. And because it was primarily driven by the fact that people see value in it once they start using it. I talked a bit about those life-changing programs like Landmark, PSI. Even if you look at religion and how they do it, most people, they go for a program and then they want to tell other people about it. So how do they make it easy to facilitate that referral? With, let's say, Landmark and PSI, I understand that through their program, they usually have like an open day. And in an open day, participants in the existing program are invited to bring their friends, to let their friends get a taste of the experience, to see what's happening, both in the program, but also with their friend. And this gives people the opportunity to get a taste of that experience and understand the value of it before committing to it. So how can you build some ways to make it easy for your customer to refer other clients, either by giving them like referral credits, referral bonuses, building in referability into the actual design of your program or services directly, actively soliciting referrals, reviews, those kind of things. You want to make it natural so that people are thoughtful about referring if they see that your product or service is of great value. The third growth engine is what Eric calls the sticky growth engine. And to kind of predicate and explain what he means over here is, on a high level, sticky engine of growth focus on improving retention. It's about keeping the existing customers that you have. And the idea and assumption is that growth will still happen if acquisition remains constant. It's not that you stop acquiring customers, but assuming that you're not acquiring more and more customers over a period of time, if your acquisition is constant, you will still grow if the people that you get stay with you for a longer period of time. One thing to understand about the sticky engine of growth is, I would say, it's not a primary engine of growth. And why you have to be mindful about it is because no matter how great your retention is, if your acquisition is constant, and if you just maintain a steady level of retention, you will find that you see that your growth is more like the one on the left side, on the left graph, right? You tend to plateau out. And that happens because you're still having positive churn. People are still leaving over a period of time, whatever the period of time is. So some revenue is lost through like cancellation or downgrades, or people who move over to alternatives, right? On the right side, they have this concept known as a negative churn. And in negative churn, the idea here is that the revenue that you generate from your existing customers exceeds the revenue that you lose through cancellations and downgrades. How is that possible? So this is only possible if you are basically increasing the lifetime value of your customer, either through upselling or cross-selling, right? You're basically focusing on how can I increase the lifetime value of my customer, increase the average revenue per user. So not only do you keep them around using your product longer, but you are actually generating more revenue from those existing customers through those upsells, through those cross-sells. So that's what we call the net negative churn. So if you want to rely on a good sticky engine of growth, make sure that you are also increasing the value of your customers instead of just keeping them as they are. Make sense? So those are just some ideas in terms of what to prioritize depending on the business that you have. I would say sticky is good if you have kind of long-term loyal customers. If you have a solution that integrates well with a customer's existing processes, workflow systems, because the more you integrate, the harder it is for them to switch out from something, right? So again, it's not to say that you only focus on one engine of growth, but there may be one or another that tends to resonate more with you. Then in that case, double down on whatever is working best and focus on that. Now let's talk a bit about how do you not only grow in terms of acquiring more customers and growing revenue, but also just in general increase your profits as well. There's this book, The Personal MBA by Josh Kaufman, and he highlights these 4 ways. And basically in his premise, which I do agree, based on the last about close to 9 years working in startups, I haven't seen anything that deviates from one of these 4 categories. So there are only 4 ways to increase revenue. So let's dive right into that. The 4 ways are: number 1 is increase the number of customers. Fairly straightforward. And it's acquiring more customers. Number 2 is increasing the average transaction size. So basically what that means is when someone buys from you, they buy more, right? They're increasing the average shopping cart. And number 3 is increasing the frequency of transactions. Not only are you getting them to buy more, but you're getting them to come back more often. And then number 4 is raising prices. Every campaign that you will see, every different strategy will fall under one of the 4. So let's dive into each of them so you can get some ideas around what you can possibly do with your company. Number 1 is increasing number of customers. Sounds obviously very simple. It just basically means get more customers. But what are some actionable things that you can do to try and kind of improve those numbers? So number 1 is testing channels. So for example, if you're getting most of your customers through, let's say, Facebook, maybe you're testing other platforms. Like now you're testing new platforms like TikTok. Maybe you're testing e-commerce. Maybe you're testing, your own e-commerce store instead of selling on Amazon. So yeah, testing those different channels. Maybe you're not reaching your customers in the right places. Maybe there are different channels that work better. Maybe there are channels that give you better quality leads. And not only do you test channels, but as you're testing channels, you're also testing the copy that works best, right? So what language resonates better with people depending on where you're reaching out to them. The second one here is expanding target market. So expanding target market is obviously not only region specific. So it could be that, okay, you're selling in, let's say, Canada, and you say, okay, I want to expand to US. Then obviously by expanding to a new market, you get more customers, but it could also be, selling your product or services to a different customer type, right? Instead of selling a solution to doctors, maybe you're also selling it to dentists. So what are other potential or adjacent target markets that you can go after? Retargeting So not only getting more customers through more new customers, but people who fall off in your funnel, how do you get them back into your funnel and get them to purchase? So how do you reduce that funnel leak? We'll talk more about that when we talk about sales strategy and funnels. Referrals, how can you improve the word of mouth aspect? If you're keen to learn a bit more about referrals, word of mouth, and virality, then you can jump to the last video under section 10 around designing viral campaigns. We'll talk more about that and a framework in and around that in that video. Being a thought leader, right? How do you create more of that inbound marketing? How do you create that pull where customers come across you? Creating content, video, podcasts, those kind of ideas. Or even facilitating regulatory compliance. So if you have a unique solution where, let's say, for example, some ones that I know is there's this company that there's a good friend of mine. He runs this company that in North America, they have green buildings. So green buildings are basically buildings where the measurement coming out of the design of the program indicates that the program is designed in such a way that it is environmentally friendly and sustainable. The challenge with green buildings and certification is a lot of it is done after the fact that the building is built. And for this company that a friend of mine runs, he basically has a company that takes into consideration not only the output and design of the building itself, but also the input into the design and into the materials that go into building the building itself. So looking at is it a wood frame building versus concrete building? Is it sustainably sourced wood? Where does the wood come from? The shipping and logistics in terms of the carbon emissions, those kind of things. So in his case, what he has found to be quite successful is increasing or advocating in and around getting regulatory compliance to adopt a kind of pre-designed component into evaluating green buildings as opposed to just the post-design components. So he's running a lot of these events in and around embodied carbon. So the idea here is, how can you look at not only the carbon footprint of a building after it's built, but also what goes into the building, right? So getting the industry to actually shift their perspective, that will actually facilitate the adoption of your solution if it's in your favor. Another one that is interesting that I remember from an example of a mentor that actually came into one of the sessions that I work with is they basically designed this solution that was a call logging solution. It would record the calls. And what they found is, in their case, they didn't engineer it, and it was a bit of luck. The regulatory bodies basically made it such that during a period of time, back in, I think, the 90s or 80s, basically any customer service related call center had to record all of their calls. And because this became a requirement, a regulatory requirement, they could easily come into the industry and say, hey, we have a solution that will help you be compliant. And in doing so, because they were favorably positioned to facilitate compliance, it made it very, very easy for them to grow and scale their business. So not to say that this is possible for every business, but consider, is there a way that you can advocate for and support adoption of a certain compliance or kind of best practice? And if so, possibly your solution will be a really well-positioned solution to address that market. Make sense? So an exercise that you can do, I'm not going to pause the video, but definitely take the time to go through this exercise if you have time, is to, number one, evaluate what channels are you currently using and kind of brainstorm around what other channels can you try. So just start to think about how can you get in front of more customers. The second method of increasing revenue is not only increasing number of customers, but now how do you increase that shopping cart size, right? How do you increase your average transaction? The most common ways is, number one, upselling. So if you're not familiar with upselling, it's basically selling a more expensive variant of the same product or service. So for example, if someone's buying a car, you're selling them a better version of the car. Maybe it's a luxury model, right? Luxury trim. A cross-sell, on the other hand, is selling other similar products that are not directly related to the main product, but are a value add to it. So for example, selling accessories, selling a cargo mat, selling a roof mount, those kind of things. Generally, those are the two main ways to increase your average transaction size. There are a whole bunch of other ideas that I can throw at you. So number one is if you run a retail location, the more time, or even if you run a website, e-commerce website, the general practice is the more time someone spends on your website or in your store, the more likely they are to spend more or buy more, which is why IKEA is designed the way it is, right? Which is why same with casinos as well. Casinos are designed to be bright. They're kind of like a maze. Once you get in, you kind of can't really find the way out that easily. So yeah, how can you get people to stay in and around, but not do it in such a way where it's bad design and it frustrates the customer? Bundles, that's another idea. So bundling things through ideas like, hey, if you buy 3 of these accessories, then I can give you a bundle discount. So basically giving them the option of spending more, and when they do spend more, they actually save more as well. In and around bundling, a few other ideas also include not only just bundling number of items together, but also, let's say, things like free shipping thresholds. Like if you buy over $50, you get free shipping. That's a form of bundling as well. Having discounts on minimum purchase. Like if you purchase over, let's say, $80, you get a 20% discount. Then it will encourage people to hit the $80 mark as well. Or even volume discounts. Like if you buy 5 or more of these items, you get a certain discount. So all of those are different forms of bundling as well. In and around cross-selling and upselling, I want to give a quick tip, because oftentimes I find that usually most sales reps find it as one of the most challenging things to do, because they've usually already closed the customer on a main product, and now they're in a position where they feel like they need to sell something else, and they don't want to feel like they're just pushing products onto a customer. So number one is, yes, you shouldn't feel like you're pushing products on a customer. Your mindset in and around upselling or cross-selling should be primarily focused on increasing value for the customer, making it more convenient for them, right? How can you create a win-win situation as opposed to a win-lose situation? For example, this example you see here, would you like to breakfast, breakfast for 2, normally $49 to your room for just $29. It's a cheaper option for them, so more value. They're getting a better experience. It is more convenient as well. Another quick tip is identify positive milestones in your buyer's experience. Usually, if someone has a positive experience, either in the sales transaction itself or with using a product or service, they're going to be much more willing to buy into an upsell or cross-sell. So what are those good moments? And those are good moments that are suitable for you to actually position that offering, the upsell, the cross-sell. Make sense? The third one that I've talked about is the frequency of transactions. So sure, you're not getting them to buy more, but how can you get them to buy more frequently? This does a combination of 2 things. Number one is it keeps you top of mind, so that customers are less likely to churn out or switch to another provider. But also, if they're buying something and buying it more often, obviously it also will increase revenue. So, how can you look at kind of recurring revenue methods instead of single purchases? And to give you one random idea here, and not necessarily something that you can apply depending on your business, but one example that I can remember as a story is there's this company I know of, and they run a jewelry company. Very simple, but you basically think that jewelry, normally a single purchase. Number 2, it's not only a regular jewelry company, but it's a jewelry company centered in the travel industry. So travel purchases are usually very infrequent, only when you do travel. But what they did is, instead of doing regular travel jewelry, they actually made a collectible edition. And what it is basically, it's just a bracelet. And what you can do is you can purchase these rings that actually have a country code stamped on it to show which countries you visited. So what it has done is every time someone visits a new country, they are incentivized to actually go back to this company and buy those new rings for the countries that they visited. So it creates that behavior where there's some recurrency of purchase in a situation where there normally isn't that recurrency, right? I talked a bit about staying top of mind, but another example here is this one that you see, Push Operations. They're a Vancouver-based company that does, I think when they started, they were a accounting service solution for the hospitality industry. So that's for hotels, for restaurants. And as you know, with accounting, it's usually something that is a once a year kind of solution when you have your tax season, right? So they said, hey, how can we stay more top of mind for our customers? What else is tied into accounting? And they looked at, okay, payroll for their employees. That's something that happens on a bi-weekly basis here, or in other countries, maybe monthly basis. But by being able to offer payroll services integrated into their accounting services, then number one, it integrates more with their existing systems, processes, and workflows. So it becomes harder for a customer to switch away. But number two, it also keeps them top of mind and it generates that recurring revenue. So it's not just a single purchase once a year, but instead now you're able to charge for that bi-weekly service that you provide or even monthly service that you provide. Make sense? Building a habit. So this is where you see things like, let's say social media as an example. There's usually a trigger. How can you design something such that when people see something, they remember your product? And then when they get triggered by the trigger, then they take a certain action. So for example, like they open up Instagram, then they get a reward, right? They get a dopamine hit, they see what their friends are doing, they get validation from their likes on their posts, and then they reinvest into the platform where they post even more, right? So how can you consider building a habit into the usage of your product service, either by associating it with a trigger or designing a reward system where when people take action, they get some sort of reward that incentivizes them to reinvest into your product or service. Another idea is considering kind of the refill or razor and blade model, right? For example, you buy a razor, but you need to buy new blades every time the blades get blunt. So the refill model is the same reason why you see people not focusing so much on the upfront cost of a product, but instead more on the subscription kind of model. There are a lot of other ideas as well, but another interesting one is in and around loyalty programs. So by building loyalty programs, it also incentivizes the customer to come back. So for example, when you have stamp cards like a restaurant, where you get one free meal after 10 meals, right? That encourages people to come back over and over again to get more of those stamps to get to that free meal. And then obviously when they get to that free meal, then it builds that loyalty and gives them the dopamine hit as well. Like, hey, I have that free meal, right? So it encourages people to buy more and hit that free reward. So yeah, consider how you can build some of these kind of different elements into either your product, your service directly, or into campaigns that are related to your product service. So a quick exercise here is take a pause, brainstorm with your team. How can you increase recurring revenue in and around your business? Is it subscription based? Can you implement something like a membership program? Is there some sort of gamification or competition that you can put into play? Can you build things up like loyalty perks or credits? So I've talked a bit about pricing previously, but now let's talk a bit about how you optimize the pricing. There are a few limitations in and around this model. So number one, it assumes that you have clarity around what your main product or service is, because this model applies, you need to basically apply this to every single stream of, your, what's the word for it? Your SKU, every single SKU that you have. So if you have different products, if you have different services, then you have to apply this to each of them. What you do is basically, as you increase pricing, a couple of things will generally change. Number one, typically the more expensive your product service is, the harder it is to convert a customer, the harder it is to get someone to buy your product service. So that increases your customer acquisition costs. Either you have to spend more time with them, more salespeople either spend more time with them, or either it takes a higher marketing budget or spend to acquire the customer. The second thing is, the more expensive your product or service is, generally your customers will churn more quickly as well. So churn being they will leave your company because maybe they can't afford it, or maybe they find a more affordable alternative and they switch to a competitor. Because of these two things, as you adjust pricing, there are two key metrics that you want to look at. One is the CAC, which I mentioned before, customer acquisition costs. The other one is the lifetime value of a customer, which also captures your churn rate. So one example here that I'll give, and I'll show you a very specific template on how you do it, is this lady over here, Dr. Alexandra Greenhill. She's a founder of this company here in Vancouver called My Best Helper. And My Best Helper is a platform where, if you're a parent, it will help you find caregivers like a nanny, a babysitter to look after your kids if you need to go out on a date or do some errands. And their revenue model is primarily through charging the caregivers, the nannies, the babysitters, a fee to be on their platform. And when they started, the fee was $10 a month. And at $10 a month, they found that the average lifetime value of their caregivers was about 6 months, because generally most people working as nannies or babysitters, they do it as a transition job. It's not something that is permanent and full-time. So on average, most of them stayed for about 6 months. So if you look at that, the lifetime value of the customer, $10 a month times 6 months is $60. And they said, okay, let's test an experiment pricing. So they slowly increased pricing. As a matter of fact, they increased pricing all the way up to $80 a month. So that's an 8x increase in pricing. At $80 a month, they found that their churn was higher. So the caregivers, instead of staying for 6 months, would stay an average of about 3 months. But if you think about it, $80 a month times 3 months, your lifetime value of your customer is $240 as opposed to $60 before. So despite having a higher churn, you still have higher lifetime value of your customer because your price is higher. Make sense? And they found that was their sweet spot, because anything higher than that, it became too hard to acquire the customers. So in this story, of course, I'm not talking about customer acquisition costs, but just to help you understand kind of how that might look like and how that might reflect optimal pricing. So here's what it looks like if you dive into actually mapping things out, if you actually use a framework around it. So before I jump into this, let me quickly talk about customer acquisition costs first. So CAC is, in these examples over here, it's a very high level metric that you use to capture how much it takes you to acquire a customer. What goes into CAC can become very, very complicated. You don't have to measure everything perfectly, although ideally you try to capture as many variables as possible. But at least capturing some form, even though it's not fully and comprehensive, is a better start than not having any form of measurement in terms of customer acquisition costs. So a very simplistic measure is, let's say if you run ads, if you spend, let's say, $100 on an ad and you get 2 customers, your customer acquisition cost is $50 per customer. Makes sense? But obviously, ads are not the only variable. So you also have to factor into things like, let's say, time it takes for you to optimize your ad campaigns. So maybe that involves like your marketing person's salary. Maybe you also factor into, let's say, your salespeople as well. So you want to try to, as best as you can, account for how long it takes to convert the customer, and in that time period, how many or how much time is allocated to the customer by a salesperson. But in doing so, you can try to come up with a more comprehensive CAC value. Make sense? So all said and done, again, you don't need to get it perfect, but basically, roughly, how much does it take for you to acquire a customer? That's your CAC. Your customer lifetime value is pretty straightforward. It just means how much money you'll make from a customer. Lifetime value, though, the caveat is that if you're a new company selling a new product or service, it's a bit harder to calculate LTV because you don't know how long a customer will stay with you because you're new, you're still operating, right? If you've been around for a while, then you probably have a clearer idea of how long a customer stays with you and how much money you get from them as well. So the kind of formula here is, as you change pricing, so first thing you need to do is you need to do what we call cohort testing. Cohort testing just ensures that you're comparing the right things so that you know that when you're changing pricing, it's not that buyer behavior is changing because of other variables. So for example, it's not because of, let's say, the recession coming around. It's not because of a new marketing campaign that you're running, but it's all purely restricted to pricing. So for example, if you do a cohort test, you might say like, okay, all of the customers who we acquire, we'll compare kind of the acquisition, both the LTV and the CAC for customers that we acquire during this period of time that we were adjusting our pricing. So maybe let's say in March, we'll try 5 different prices, and then we'll track and follow those customers over time to see their lifetime value, and also to ensure that we have accurate measurement of their customer acquisition costs. So make sure that you're comparing that, because there could be other variables that affect CAC and LTV besides just pricing. Make sense? So make sure you batch your testing, do your cohort testing. I won't go into how to do cohort testing, but that's basically the concept. So number one, as you are doing your testing, you map out the prices that you have. The easy rule of thumb to start is because most companies tend to underprice when they begin, you just start by doubling your price. Double your price until you notice there's a big difference. And then when you have that big difference, then you can fall back to the previous pricing, and then you can try to tweak and try to find the optimal pricing in between thereafter. But as you change your pricing, regardless of whether you're doubling it or doing your fine tuning, you have another column where you're basically measuring the customer's life cycle in the form of months, if at all possible. If not in months, if you don't have a subscription service, then your idea is, let's say even if you're a consulting company that does a project-based approach, again, the longer you've been in operations, the clearer idea you have in terms of how much a client might, or how often a client might come back to you for another project, right? So generally, maybe it's not going to be just in months here. Maybe it's a direct value that you have. But let's say if you have subscription, then it's a bit easier to calculate. So here, for example, is like, let's say at $50, customer stays for 6 months, right? $100, 6 months, $200, 5 months, so on and so forth. The lifetime value calculation is pretty straightforward. It's basically you take price, multiply it by life cycle. That's your lifetime value. And then you map out your customer acquisition costs. And what you are trying to do as you try to optimize pricing is you're looking at this thing called the LTV over customer acquisition cost ratio. The higher this number, the better. And why is because what you can see over here is, for example, at $50, you get $300 per customer, and it costs you $20 to acquire them. The ratio here is 15. As you increase the price, naturally, your customer value is going to increase. But if it is too difficult to acquire them, then the number is going to become lower. Make sense? So here you can see the sweet spot is this one, 32, which means that at $800, customer stays for 4 months. So yes, they are churning out. But your lifetime value of the customer is $3,000, $200, and it only costs you $100 to get that customer. So there is a maximum difference in between these two numbers. And the higher the difference, the higher your profit margin, basically. So this is the same thing as depicted in a graph, just to help you visualize it. So the blue one is just lifetime value. The red is your customer acquisition cost. And the orange, which is what you want to plot out, and you want to just look for the highest peak, is your LTV divided by CAC ratio. Make sense? So now that I've talked a bit about the 4 pillars in terms of how to increase revenue, again, I'll give you a refresher. Number 1 is get more customers. Number 2, get them to buy more when they do buy, increase transaction size. Number 3, increase frequency of purchase. How can you build in some recurrency around that? And then number 4, increase pricing. I want to give some examples to see if you're able to identify how some of these companies apply one of those 4 in their kind of strategies or campaigns. So IKEA has a restaurant. Why do they have a restaurant in their furniture store? So the simple answer for IKEA is, with the restaurant, the customers, number 1, spend more time in the store, so it increases the average order size. But number 2, it also gets people to come back more often, because sometimes people come there just to eat, and then since they're there to eat, they end up shopping anyways. Another one here is Travelers Collective. So we talked about this example actually. So this is the one where they have those travel rings, the travel accessories, and by selling those keychains and that you can attach those rings to for each country that you visit, they actually get more recurrency around the single purchase of the keychain itself. And just to give you an idea in terms of revenue and numbers, when they started, they were making about 6,000 a month, sorry, 30,000 a month after 6 months of operations just by selling those keychains. So the longer basically someone spends more time, this is more about IKEA, the example that we talked about, is the longer someone spends in the store or the more frequent they come, the more items they purchase, right? The other example here is this one, the printer and cartridge model. So you can see over here, it used to be that printers were really expensive upfront, but now printers are super cheap. And cartridges, the refills, that's actually where they make most of their profit from. So that's in and around increasing that frequency of transaction, right? It's not, they might even take a loss on selling the unit itself, but they clearly make up for it from the refills that they actually offer. So yeah, recurring revenue, higher lifetime value. All right, so I'm going to take a quick pause here. I'm going to pause the video and then I'll come back and we'll talk a bit about troubleshooting revenue problems. All right, now that I've given you hopefully some interesting ideas that will help you think about how you can explore different campaigns and increase revenue, let's talk a bit about troubleshooting some revenue-related issues. So this might be the case if you're already operating a business and you find that you're up against a bottleneck somewhere. So how do you, number one, troubleshoot and figure out what the bottleneck is? Number two, and how do you unstuck yourself and get out of that bottleneck? So the most common problems are usually, number one, not having enough leads, not having enough new customers. Number two is if you have a good volume of leads, you're struggling with closing them. Or number three is not only struggling with closing them, is taking the time it takes for you to close them. So maybe you're closing really well, but it takes you quite a while to close those leads. So those are usually the three main reasons. So if you have a problem with getting more leads, it's usually what we call a top of funnel problem. And this is where you typically want to start. It always makes more sense to fix top of funnel problems rather than optimizing conversion. If you have the best website, converts really well, but you are simply not getting enough traffic to it, then who cares if you did a great job converting with optimizing your website? So make sure you get enough traffic first, solve the top of funnel before you get to the bottom of the funnel. So generally, some possible culprits that cause the top of funnel problem is, marketing challenge. Maybe you have in and around marketing, you're not saying the right things. Maybe you have poor copy, you're not using the right words. You don't have clear call to actions. Maybe you are advertising in the wrong channels, right? Maybe you don't have a process. Maybe you don't have what we call an evergreen strategy, right? So you always need to look for new content to post instead of being able to post the same thing over and over again that is repeatable. Maybe you're not tracking data. Maybe you're not using data to improve it. Maybe you're not targeting the right customers. Or maybe you are not capturing leads. Maybe you actually have good traffic, but you don't have a call to action. You don't have a lead magnet, those kind of things. So these are some possible things that will cause this top of funnel issue. Another thing that could be, if it's not marketing related, it could be a sales related problem. So if it's an outbound thing that you do with your business, maybe you have founders or sales reps that are not comfortable with sales and they don't have a regular rhythm or schedule routine around performing sales related activities. And I see this very, very often in consulting companies because consultants first and foremost aren't salespeople. They're good at doing whatever they do for their consultancy, right? If it's marketing, they're good at marketing. If it's, let's say, event planning, then they're good at event planning. They're not good at sales. And what they usually find is once they get some client, they get really busy servicing those clients and then they stop selling. And then they fall into that period where they have a lull, no sales, and then they need to do a lot of sales again. And then they get really busy, they get a lot of business, and then they don't have time for sales. And then they again have the lull again. So you want to try to avoid that kind of cyclical revenue cycle. Try to make sure that you're having some sort of routine around prospecting. you're actively looking for new customers every single week, even if you already have clients and projects ongoing. Make sense? So build a routine around getting new customers so that you don't have to constantly chase the money. Maybe you can explore different growth models. Maybe you're hammering away on marketing, putting a lot of effort into ads, but that's not the right channel for you. Maybe a different growth model is better for you. Or maybe you have a lot of funnel leak. So if that's the case, then how do you recapture some of those people who fall out of your funnel? So how do you do retargeting? If you're not familiar with retargeting, it's basically getting back to those people who, let's say, came to your website, but they left. So how do you target them again? So if you have tools like a CRM solution, you can re-advertise to them. Or if people have added items to your cart, but they didn't check out, you can follow up with an email and say, hey, notice you have some items in your cart. Just some sort of reminder to get them back into the funnel. Make sense? A quick tip is with channel testing, if you have multiple channels, make sure you're testing your customer acquisition costs per channel, because you may find that certain channels are more effective with conversion, either because maybe the customers are more willing to buy in that channel, or maybe your target customer is more active on that channel, or maybe because simply the channel is more effective for selling, right? So look at each of your channel and ensure that you're looking at conversion in terms of your customer acquisition costs for each of those channels. And obviously, if you find that a certain channel is working well, double down on that. The second problem that I talked about is trouble closing leads. So what could be the reason? So number one is obviously if you have the wrong target audience, it's going to be difficult to convert them, no matter how many of them you get into your funnel, right? So making sure you qualify your customers properly and get into those the customers that are right fit. A quick tip here is to identify, red flags. What are some red flags that will help you screen out non-ideal customers so you don't end up wasting time with them? So yeah, wrong target audience, unqualified leads, they're very closely related. Maybe they are the right audience, but they're not mentally in the right space. Maybe they're not ready to close yet. So making sure you qualify it. Making sure you have a nurturing process, because related to unqualified leads, you want to make sure that you are actually giving them the right material, marketing material, assets, such that the customer can kind of build up their kind of frame of mind so that they are more ready to purchase, either by giving them more information so that they understand the landscape, they understand what their problem is, they properly diagnose their issues, they understand how you differ from competitors. And then once all of that falls into place, they are better qualified, they're more ready to buy, then you can go into trying to convert them. Or maybe it could be due to bad sales techniques. So maybe you have good leads, but your salespeople lack the experience. They're afraid to ask for the sale. They're bad at following up, or they don't know how to deal with objections. Those kind of things. So these are some potential kind of trouble closing leads type of issues. In and around untrained sales reps, that could also fall under the marketing side as well. If you don't have the right call to actions, if you don't have the right ask, and that kind of causes there to be an issue in the funnel where a lot of people either don't take the next step for the action. In and around long sales cycle, generally, two of the main reasons is number one, not leading the process, not setting clear next steps. So one example is, if you have a sales call, you want to try to set the next appointment during the call rather than going back and forth through email after the call to try to set up the next appointment, because that will lengthen the process. People take more time going back and forth. So how can you set clear next steps so that people know both in the sales process, but also in the implementation process as well? Number two, qualifying the customer. So we talked about that before, but a framework that you can use is BANT. So do they have the right budget? Are they the right person to speak to? Do they have the authority? Do they have the need? Do they actually have the problem? Do they feel it right now? And the fourth one is timeline. So for example, timeline is especially relevant here. If you're, let's say, reaching out to a customer, let's say, for example, you sell to schools. And schools generally, they have seasons, right? Because a school year starts, let's say, in September in North America. And then they have their budget cycle for their institution. Maybe that's in March. and then they will have, spring break, and then there's summertime as well, school's out. So you need to understand what is the timeline for an organization to make decisions, because depending on the solution that you're selling, maybe it's best for you to approach them right before the end of their budget, because they have some unused budget that they want to spend. Or maybe it's best to approach them right after their budget cycle when they have new budget that they can commit to new projects. Or maybe they make purchase decisions, let's say before a school year, because they're going to implement it during the school year. Or maybe they actually have to vet some of these solutions ahead of time. So maybe, let's say, before summer, so they can test it during the summertime, and then they can implement it during the upcoming school year, right? So you need to understand their timeline, because if you're approaching them at the wrong time, then naturally your sales cycle is going to be longer, because you are not touching them during the right kind of timing. Make sense? We've talked a bit about freemium and paywalls, pay gates when we talked a bit about pricing, when we mentioned usage-based pricing. So I'm not going to cover this again, but generally avoid the free trial kind of period, because that extends your sales cycle again. And if you're tiering based on features, again, you're making assumptions that those features are features that your power users want. And they may actually, in fact, be different users compared to your regular users. So maybe you need to acquire different kind of users. So the best practice is to go after volume, right? What is the usage-based pricing model that you can approach? Formality is another thing. So the more formal a process is, the longer it takes a client to close a contract. And one of my very favorite examples over here is generally when you think of a contract, usually a company will need to involve their legal team. But if you use the word, let's say, a proposal, it becomes more of a collaborative partnership, where you are proposing something, the other party may make more suggestions, and then you may amend it and work together moving forward, right? So remember, sales is not a single transaction. You need to be able to lead the customer through that escalation until they are comfortable. And it's the same with the proposal process. It's a working documentation that has a few iterations. It's not something that you put out there, you give them, and then they have to take it or leave it. You want to make sure that you have a basic outline for them, and then they can see clear value. And then from there, you can get them to commit to, number one, understanding that, yes, this is of value. And then you can move on to talking about pricing, negotiating, implementation, those kind of things. So get them to confirm to the details, get them to confirm their timeline, get them to buy into the benefits before you try to commit to putting a price on things as well. Generally, having a proposal-based approach also helps build relationships with your client. It becomes less prescriptive and more collaborative. They feel like they are a part of this process, and therefore, by being a part of the process, they are more willing to follow through implementation as well. One very stark example I can remember is there was this entrepreneur that I worked with in the past, and he has this solution where they sell a software that will help hospitals manage their university student interns. So if you look at it, their key customer is a hospital, and they're working very closely with universities as well. Hospitals, universities, very well known to be very bureaucratic and have long sales cycles. And in his case, he found that his sales cycle was unsurprisingly about a year long. It takes him about a year to close a customer. And in my opinions, a year is definitely too long. I'd say the maximum in terms of a sales cycle should be no more than 3 months. And so I challenged him on this, and he was like, no way I can get it down to 3 months. So I said, why don't you go out and do some mystery shopping? Look at your competitor and try to see how they convert. And actually, through mystery shopping, he found that their competitors were closing customers in only, I think, about a month. And how were they doing that? They found that their competitors were not using contracts. And what their competitors did is they allowed free testing and using of their platform. And then when people sign up, created an account with your platform, there were terms of use and terms of services built into the platform itself. And from there, once people use the platform, they see the value, then they just send off a quick, simple proposal for a pilot with a small department. And so by changing that and adopting a similar process as what their competitors were doing, they were able to bring their sales cycle down to about a month instead of even 3 months. So down to a month from a year. That's a stark difference. So think about how you can either deformalize the process, make it more collaborative, or kind of build the legalities into the terms of services instead of having a contract upfront. I'm not saying that you are hiding things intentionally, but you just want to make it as easy as possible to have your customers see value immediately, because once they see value, then they are more than willing to negotiate the legalities after, right? So you still want to ensure that you're protecting yourself, but make sure that you try to give them a taste of value. If you remember the decision threshold, how do you reduce the risk? Maybe reduce the scope of the project. Maybe it's doing a pilot. Maybe it's changing offering a kind of mini offering or sub offering. So think about some of these, because it will also help you get in the door a lot more quickly. One other example that I remember that is kind of interesting is there's another mentor that I work with, and he mentioned that how he would work with a lot of projects is he would run these meetings where he would try to get all the stakeholders in the room together, and he would whiteboard the session, plan out all of the opportunities, the challenges, the low-hanging fruits, action items, and at the end of the meeting, he would take a picture of the whiteboard, and he would just say, hey, if you like what we discussed today, let this picture, let this whiteboard, let this be our MOU to start, and then we can get started right away. And then from there, obviously, he can send a more formal MOU, which is, if you're not familiar with MOU, it's a memorandum of understanding, kind of like an informal contract. And then that ensures that you can just more quickly get up and running. And obviously, not to say again that you're avoiding the actual contract, but it just kind of gets everyone to agree more quickly so that you can move forward and make it easy for them to understand the value. Make sense? So some quick tips in and around proposal contracts, if you're in that space and you have to use something like that. Always try to meet in person first and foremost before you send over a proposal. If you send over a proposal without discussing it ahead of time, it's hard for you to identify any sort of objections or why someone might hesitate. Because, let's say if you send a proposal and you don't hear back from them, or if they don't set up a meeting with you, then you don't know why, right? So have the conversation first, send the proposal as a confirmation of the conversation. Make sense? If people are asking for a proposal ahead of time, or if they're asking for one after the conversation, then you want to clarify and ask, like, is there something that was missed during the conversation? Ideally, you should have covered all the points such that whatever they see in the proposal is not a surprise to them. Make sense? So generally, you can send one after, but try not to send it before a meeting. So yeah, these are some tips that hopefully will help you come up with some ideas on increasing revenue, or kind of troubleshoot some of the issues that you might have around conversion. In the next videos, we'll move directly into sales. So let's dive into those.